السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. حملة هندست لضمان العدالة للشعب الفلسطيني بوسائل وأساليب مختلفة تسعى من خلالها إلى ممارسة الضغوط العملية على إسرائيل. حملة المقاطعة وسحب الاستثمارات الإسرائيلية وفرض العقوبات عليها في اسكتلندا من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا.
على الجبال خلف التلال وفي الوديان ستهزمون برا جئتم بحرا جئتم جوا جئتم ستسحقون.
المقاومة فن جامع ولغة إنسانية مشتركة وقيمة واحدة تتخطى الحدود والجغرافيا والفواصل والكلمات والألوان والأعراق وحتى اللغات. منهم من قاوم بقلمه وبكلماته ومواقفه، ومنهم بفنه وأفكاره وسلاحه ودفاعه.
والجيش المهزوم إن عاد الكرة لن يرجع.
مقاومة الاحتلال والاستعمار والاستيطان والظلم جمعت شعوب العالم بيمينه ويساره دعما لها. الحملة الاسكتلندية للتضامن مع فلسطين واحدة من تلك المقاومات. انطلقت هذه الحملة خريف عام 2000 مناصرة الانتفاضة الفلسطينية الثانية ضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وضمت فروعا وجماعات من المؤازرين في الكثير من المدن والجامعات الاسكتلندية، بالإضافة إلى أفراد مستقلين. الحملة الاسكتلندية للتضامن مع فلسطين تسعى إلى حشد الدعم من كافة أطياف وقماشة المجتمع الاسكتلندي الملونة بألوان عشائر اسكتلندا. تسعى أيضا إلى رصد تحول المزاج الشعبي بعيدا عن إسرائيل بالاعتماد على سياسات المقاطعة وقطع الاستثمارات وفرض العقوبات على إسرائيل ونظامها العنصري. معظم أنشطة هذه الحملة في اسكتلندا تقوم على أساس دعم المناشدة الفلسطينية لمقاطعة إسرائيل ومؤسساتها وشركاتها، وتفعيل المقاطعة الرياضية والثقافية والفنية. مؤسس ورئيس الحملة الاسكتلندية للتضامن مع فلسطين المحتلة ومنظم مبادرة أهلا بكم إلى أسطول جو فلسطين 2012 السيد نابيير كيف يصف أبرز الدروس والعبر المستقاة من حملات المقاطعة لإسرائيل في اسكتلندا، وما أبرز النشاطات التي قاموا بها دعما للقضية الفلسطينية، وماذا عن العقبات التي يواجهونها في بلادهم وفي الخارج من جراء المقاطعة، وإلى أي مدى يخدم انتشار ثقافة المقاطعة لإسرائيل النضال من أجل تحرير فلسطين المحتلة.
رعبا نحن لكم قد جئنا ثم الويل لكم إن عدنا أرضا جئتوها أحياء ستنتهون بها أشلاء.
Mick Napier, founder of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome to the Inside, sir.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. How did you become active in solidarity with Palestine? And how did you come to found the Palestine Scottish Solidarity Campaign?
Beginning of the Second Intifada. I was invited to join a small demonstration on the steps of the US consulate in Edinburgh. And a few people made some speeches about Israeli savagery, barbarity, the killing that was taking place. And then after half an hour, someone said, thank you for coming, and you can go home now. And I asked if anyone wanted to go down to the main street in Edinburgh the following Saturday and begin to campaign, give out some leaflets, inform people about what was happening, and to introduce the notion that the British government was very complicit in the crimes of the State of Israel, and that therefore British citizens really had a moral duty, but it was also in our interest to stand up against those crimes and that complicity.
Is it only the speeches, sir, that led you to this, or you did the homework in advance about what is Palestine, what is happening to the Palestinian people, and what is their plight actually worldwide?
Well, yes, I knew that Israel, that the Zionists had been given British protection in order to colonize Palestine from 1918. But you know, the world's a pretty brutal place, and millions of people die in the Congo, and what do you pay attention to? And it was Palestinian resistance and the Intifada which changed everything. Because when people resist, then around the world solidarity becomes possible. But during quiet periods it's much less so. So I think it was the fact of Palestinian resistance and the Intifada that sparked an awareness, a much wider awareness in the West than there had been before about the situation there.
Let's come to Scotland. What are some of the lessons learned in BDS campaigning in Scotland? Boycott, divestment and sanctions in Scotland.
We base ourselves on a single incontestable fact that every public opinion poll in Britain and around the world, polls conducted by the European Union, which they later apologised for, polls conducted by the BBC World Service, by British newspapers and so on, everyone presents a picture that Israel is deeply unpopular, and that at the level of public opinion...
I will quote some of these opinion polls.
I mean, when you ask people what they actually think, this is quite separate from, say, public discourse. So, for example, in Germany, it's very, very difficult to publicly campaign in support of the people of Palestine. In Britain, Scotland, it's much easier. But at the level of public opinion about what people actually think, it's remarkably uniform across the whole of Europe and far beyond, that Israel is held in great suspicion, and people are very much predisposed to support appeals on behalf of the people of Palestine.
Allow me here to refer to what you said, that in the arena of world public opinion, Israel has already been decisively defeated by the struggle of the Palestinians, and also over the years numerous credible opinion polls have confirmed this issue, including a BBC, as you said, World Service poll of opinion in 27 countries, which reported that Israel is viewed more negatively than any other country in the world, and most negatively in the Middle East, although also in Europe. How instrumental was the BDS in this?
Not very much. I think it was mainly images on TV of a small boy confronting a gigantic Israeli tank. Image after image of Israel tying a child to the bonnet of a jeep before driving into an area. The use of human shields, the mass imprisonment, the use of white phosphorus on civilian populations. These images penetrated people's minds, and despite the massively skewed pro-Israeli coverage by the British media, preeminently the BBC but others as well, these images were able to let people see the reality of the situation. So I think BDS is the result of this awareness. I don't think it's the cause. I mean, it may have had some input, but basically we are responding to popular mood, or we're building on a popular mood which is caused by the stark reality of Israeli oppression of the Palestinians.
What is the key role of the BDS movement?
It's very simple. There are really two, I think. Can I go back to the South African struggle for freedom? When the liberation struggle in South Africa was militarily crushed, and the prisons were full of people like Nelson Mandela, but many, many other freedom fighters, the boycott movement, women in Ireland and so on who went on strike rather than handle South African goods in their shops, evoked a response in South Africa. South Africans learned that although they were being battered and crushed by the apartheid regime, they were evoking support around the world. And that changed the balance of force inside South Africa itself. Because in that kind of struggle, morale is everything. And if you feel isolated, morale slumps. If you feel that the whole world is beginning to move in your support, then things change. Our aim is very simple. It's to take effective boycott action here against any institution that's linked to the Israeli state. That could be diplomats, Israeli companies, economic, political, sporting. We want to send a message to Palestine that although the Israelis can kill them and do kill them in large numbers, people around the world are beginning to move in their support. And it's Israel that's the ghetto. They're building walls to imprison Palestinians in horrible, horrible ghettos. But at the court of public opinion, which ultimately, I don't mean immediately, but ultimately is the only one that counts, Israel's in a ghetto and is isolated. So our aim is to raise the morale of Palestinians insofar as we can. We know we are ancillary, we're auxiliary to the main struggle in the Middle East, but it's to play an auxiliary role of raising Palestinian morale and trying to damage Israeli morale by showing that they will suffer the more they continue with these crimes.
How effective was the movement in this sense, which is to raise the Palestinian morale? And the aims of the BDS, how realistic, plausible, and applicable were they?
We have a major challenge, and that's the situation inside Palestine at the moment, which is, given the role of the Palestinian Authority vis-à-vis the Israelis, it's inside the prison itself, things are not as good as they should be. But there's no doubt that the stories are getting through to Palestine that Israeli goods cannot enter South African docks, ports, because the dockers in Durban port in South Africa have a policy of any Israeli goods being identified are turned away and are not unloaded from the ships. And that when Israeli sporting groups and cultural groups meet here with very determined opposition and cannot perform as normal, the message back in Palestine is significant. I remember once in Scotland we went to an Israeli-Scotland football game. 700 of us, I think. I don't want to exaggerate. And we massively interrupted the game. It had to go out in silence because of the noise. And when I went to Palestine a month later, beside the rubble of a home that the Israelis had demolished and killed 10 people, the young woman there told me that when they heard on the radio and on their TV stations that hundreds of people in Scotland were out at night to support the Palestinians against the Israelis, she said, I think I'm quoting, it gave us the courage to continue. Right. Now, we don't want to exaggerate our influence. We realise that our government is still selling parts for drones which fly over Gaza and select and kill Palestinians. And our task is a huge one, and we've only just begun to move along that road. But, you know, we got a very early Christmas present last year because an Israeli diplomat was quoted in an Israeli newspaper saying that every trip to Scotland by an Israeli delegation, official or unofficial, he said, was like a visit to enemy territory. And we would like to maintain that and to make it more real.
Right. You talk now about one activity that you've done in support of, you know, something on the ground. How can you describe your other activities in Scotland when it comes to the boycott of Israeli-owned companies, so to say, or Israeli-supportive companies?
Companies, well, I can give you one example. You know, it's a well-kept secret in this society.
Because, you know, the people in the Middle East, as you said, they are not so much aware. Perhaps only few of them know. So it's good to let the people know more.
And that is also the case here. I mean, it's a well-kept secret that people here change things. And that every fundamental change has been caused by ordinary people. But, you know, there's one Israeli company here, for example, called Eden Springs. They in fact operate from occupied Syria, from the Golan Heights, and they have contracts to sell water. The water comes from Scotland, but they're complicit in Israeli crimes in the Middle East. And they have contracts to sell water here in Britain, and indeed across Europe. They're called Eden Springs. And we initiated a campaign, patiently, slowly, to try to get their contracts cancelled by the City of Edinburgh, the City of Glasgow, by Strathclyde University, by a whole number of different people who unknowingly bought the water. During Operation Cast Lead, the massacres there led to student occupations of universities, and Eden Springs was kicked out of every Glasgow university, half a dozen of them. We got contracts cancelled all over the place. But still they insisted that we were having no impact. But we recently came across a letter from the head of the company to the Scottish Government saying, please help us. The campaign launched by Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign is, quote, threatening the entire future of our company and asking the Scottish Government for money. Sadly, the Scottish Government gave them £200,000. And that's a scandal that they're ashamed of. And they
but
don't
at
want
least you dealt a blow to them.
We did. And we've dealt other blows as well. When football groups come here, when sporting groups...
The cricket, the Israeli cricket team.
Well, you know...
We will talk more, sir, about these activities, but we have to stop now for a short break. And then we will come also to talk a bit, perhaps, and highlight You know, in this very bright picture, there is a dim light of weakness in the BDS campaign. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود لمتابعة من الداخل من اسكتلندا. ابقوا معنا. رئيس الحملة الاسكتلندية للتضامن مع فلسطين المحتلة السيد نابيير هل يرى جدوى فعلية للفلسطينيين في انتشار ثقافة مقاطعة إسرائيل عالميا؟ وأين وصلت المقاطعة الأكاديمية والثقافية والرياضية في اسكتلندا؟ وما هي نقاط الضعف الأبرز في مقاطعة البضائع الإسرائيلية؟
Boycott enables us to offer concrete, practical support to the people of Palestine. Once again, one doesn't want to exaggerate it, but only last week, a French multinational company called Veolia, who are building a light railway from Jerusalem to the settlements in the West Bank, and who have been subject to persistent campaigning internationally, sold all their bus operations in Israel, all of them. They've pulled out, and that's a victory, an economic victory for the boycott campaign. Because Veolia was losing literally billions of euros in contracts from Stockholm in Sweden to Melbourne. We managed to get them removed from bidding for waste disposal and other very lucrative contracts in London and Edinburgh and across Scotland. So that's a practical attack, if you like, peaceful, democratic attack on a company that's complicit in Israeli violence against the people of Palestine. And it was successful, is that it is Palestinian-led, that it's Palestinians who are appealing for action against Veolia, and when they ask for people around the world to move in their support, if that action is concerted and focused, then it can be very effective in the economic sphere. In football, or basketball or cricket, we've seen very effective protests which have stopped games, prevented the Israelis from conducting business as normal. And can I just say one thing, if I can divert very briefly to cultural academic boycott. It indicates something if someone boasts that their life is normal for a short period. And the Israelis, every time a cultural worker, every time a musician or a singer of any fame goes to Israel, the Israelis say, look, they're coming to Israel. But you know, that's normal around the world. But now, many singers and performers refuse to perform in Israel.
And actors and
actors and so on. They just, Bruce Springsteen doesn't go. Elvis Costello is a major figure here, and many others have indicated that they will not perform in Israel, as was the case with South Africa. So this is beginning to have an impact. And when you look at studies of Israeli morale, you find that now, as opposed to the past, many Israelis are ashamed of being Israeli. They know when they travel around the world that when they mention that they are Israeli, they're going to encounter problems in Scotland and India and everywhere else. So the boycott's having an effect on morale already with the Israelis, and some effect with Palestinians as well.
On the other hand, sir, what is the main weakness or the major weaknesses of the boycott of Israeli goods and the BDS?
Coordination, organisation. I think it's possible in the last 5-6 years since
a movement, excuse me, sir, that can achieve that much. You lack coordination?
Yep. We lack sufficient coordination. There's a degree of coordination. There's a degree of worldwide coordination. But I think we've reached a stage now where the level of organisation that we currently have has taken us as far as we can go. So, for example, an Israeli ballet, an Israeli dance company came to Scotland last year, performed at the Edinburgh Festival, and of course they were disrupted every performance. People went in, people stood outside, but people went inside and disrupted the performance and said no business is normal while Israel is crushing Palestinian cultural life. Why should you come here and behave and be treated normally? It's not going to happen. And then from Edinburgh we managed to organise UK-wide, so that every single performance in the UK, from north to south, was treated in the same way. And it was a debacle. It was a major defeat for the Israelis in their attempts to promote Israel as a normal state. We need to learn from the South African campaign. We need a sort of campaign which doesn't start from zero when it's faced with a challenge and we quickly coordinate something to meet the need. We need an ongoing campaign which is organised in such a way that there's a man who was in the British cabinet called Peter Hain, and he might want to cover up his past, but in the past he organised a group called Stop All Racist Tours. And they broke up rugby games, they broke up South African visits of every kind, and that's what we wish to emulate. We don't want to just protest, we want to stop any Israeli cultural, sporting, political initiatives here in Scotland or in the UK.
In this sense, what are the major obstacles that you face on this track?
Well, I think if you look back at South Africa, things were very substantially coordinated around the world by the ANC, the African National Congress, and their supporters. And they were organised in a very open and transparent way. If you look today, we have groups of very keen, enthusiastic, wonderful people all over the world who take action. But they take action in a sporadic and in an uncoordinated way. I think if we were to focus on if we could mobilise together, if we could focus on particular targets at particular times, we would have a greater degree of success. So I think it was important in the past to stress the positivity, the remarkable degree to which the BDS movement spread and developed. But I think now we're coming to a stage where we have to be more reflective of our weaknesses and change our method of organisation, I think.
Right. You also organised an initiative back in 2012 called Welcome to Palestine 2012 Fly to La. What was this project and what happened back then?
Well, it was basically an idea to show people around the world how nasty and how much of a prison Israel had created for the Palestinians, so that if someone turned up at Tel Aviv airport and simply wished to go to Palestine, so you approach the passport desk and somebody says, "Where are you going?" You say, "I wish to go to Palestine," then of course you go to prison. And a lot of people in the West had not understood the nature of the degree of how Israel imprisons the Palestinians. If you think about it, it's been a constant of Zionist policy since 1948 to isolate Palestine from external support, from external solidarity, and to build bridges of support between Israel and Washington or London and so on, but to isolate the Palestinians while the process of dispossession goes on. And the Welcome to Palestine was an attempt to get people from around the world to fly into Tel Aviv airport, to tell the Israelis in advance, "We're coming, you can send us to prison, you can do what you want, but we're coming to visit Palestinians openly," in order that we could come back to Britain and say, "Look, this is what the Israelis are like." No matter how peaceful you are with the Israelis, no matter how decent and democratic and peaceful and just getting on with normal life you are, Israel will deny a normal life to the people of Palestine. So it came as a bit of a shock to people back in Britain. In my work, on TV and radio shows, when we talked about it, people had not realised the real nature of the Israeli occupation. And Welcome to Palestine helped to do that.
How were you able to challenge as a movement and as a campaign the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, in Scotland and also in France, in Australia and elsewhere?
I think our starting point was really important. A lot of people buy into the idea of a two-state solution. We think it's complete nonsense. We think that it's a way of cooping the Palestinians up inside smaller and smaller ghettos in order to try and disappear them as quickly as possible. The JNF is not just a criminal organisation in the West Bank, as it was in Gaza, but across the entire land surface of Palestine, historic Palestine, from Haifa to Hebron. They operate a policy of strict apartheid, so that in South Africa the government would pass laws saying white people and black people have to go to different schools, have to live in different areas, have to use different toilets, can't sit in the same bench in the train station. Israel doesn't do that usually. They subcontract the apartheid to the JNF. And the JNF buys, steals, takes over violently, ethnically cleansed land from the Israeli state, and the JNF runs the apartheid system. So that, for example, in 94% of Israel, 48-67 Israel, Arabs can't live there. Palestinian citizens of Israel, that is those Palestinians who were trapped inside Israel when the state was set up, cannot buy, lease or live on this land. It's for Jews only. It's Jewish only land. It's a strict system of apartheid. And the fact that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and David Cameron in the past were sponsors of that organisation, we flagged up. We told people the true nature of the JNF. And you know...
And there is an electronic book in this sense that is titled JNF Colonizing Palestine since 1901.
Yes, we've produced a whole number of books, but we've also managed to build up a degree of public support that didn't exist there before. Because if you say, I mean, in many years of campaigning, I've found that the Zionists and the British government cleverly present the issue as one of two tribes fighting each other for no sensible reason. And there's Palestine and there's Israel, and they're fighting. The nature of the JNF campaign is that it's a social struggle for democracy and freedom and against racism and apartheid. And the true nature of the JNF, when you talk to 100 people out of 100, when you talk to them about the JNF, they support us. Because we simply say, imagine your city.
So that's why JNF is a core issue of BDS.
Yes.
Solidarity.
It's a core issue for us because if we talk to people in Glasgow, where we are now, and we say, how would you imagine Glasgow if we said all Jews have to live in a small part of Glasgow, or all black people have to live in a small part of Glasgow? People are horrified and say people should be able to live wherever they want. And it's a disgusting nightmare, the idea that people cannot live in a particular area because of their race or their ethnicity or their religion or something. It's a nightmare, it's horrible. And we say that's Israel today. And the JNF organises this and controls this. And by the way, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are sponsors, patrons of the JNF. Now, David Cameron found the JNF so toxic that he withdrew his sponsorship last year.
Right.
Because of the campaign.
Right, Mr. Mick Napier, founder of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, many thanks indeed for joining us and many thanks indeed for this information.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد بقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين من اسكتلندا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.